is how we as teachers can use silence to reduce the cognitive load of learning. So Dylan Williams, one of my favourite people to read, said in a tweet, I think in 2017, that actually this idea of cognitive load theory is one of the single most important things for teachers to know about. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit more about myself in a moment, but I'm going to admit that I've only really started to think about how cognitive load theory impacts on my pupils and on my teaching practice in the last couple of years. So my aim in this webinar is kind of to take you through my process and to first have a think about how learning and cognitive load are linked, and then to talk about my experiences and what I'm trying to do in my classroom as a result of this research that I've tried to introduce. Now, when I previously said, oh yeah, I'll do a webinar on this, it was quite a while ago actually, and then COVID has kind of happened this year. So there's been lots of different things that have come into play this year, but I'll kind of go through these as I'm talking. Now, as Sylvia said, I am a maths teacher. I've tried to take the maths out of my presentation and to have this as more of a general teaching thing. So I'm trying to leave the maths to one side for the moment. So one of the things I do have, and I would like to get everybody to do, if you can, is before I start to talk properly, I have set up a Jamboard. The link is posted in the chat, and I've also, hopefully, fingers crossed, because this is the first time I've done this, I created a QR code that you will hopefully be able to join the Jamboard on. And what I'd really like to do is to just get an idea, what is your definition of learning? So what does it mean to you? And what do you think learning looks like in a classroom? So if an observer or an inspector or your line manager comes into your classroom, what do they want to see? What does learning look like? And if I say I just give you maybe 5 minutes or so, obviously no right or no wrong answers, nobody's going to judge, but I'd just like to see what thoughts are out there. So what do we think? Okay, all right then. So I'm going to come back to me talking. I did say, and I've just realised I've broken maybe the first rule of teaching, that teachers are supposed to tell you the truth. I said I'd taken the maths out of my presentation, and then I've realised what I've actually done. I wanted to introduce a little bit more about myself, and I've done it using numbers. So I'm sorry, this is the only part of my presentation where there's going to be numbers on the screen, I promise. But to give you just a little bit more background about me and where I'm coming from. So 2005 is on there, the biggest number. This is actually the year that I started teaching. So prior to 2005, I was actually working in the finance industry. I was an investment accountant. So that's had been my career for a number of years. I'm not going to reveal how many years. And it was a pretty successful career, but for me personally, it wasn't the most fulfilling career. And in 2005, I'd not long been married, and my husband was a teacher. And I think I suddenly realised one day that I was far more interested in his job and what he was doing than in my job. And that was what made me kind of had this complete change of direction and take the plunge and decide to retrain as a teacher. And I went from being super confident and feeling as though I could walk into my office, manage people, know what I was doing, to actually crying just about every single day. So that was nobody tells you that being a teacher is hard, and every day you're learning and adapting and changing what you're doing. Now, obviously I teach maths, and in 2005 I started working in a secondary school. I'm from the southeast of the UK, not far from London, and it was a great school that I was working in. We taught single sex, and we also taught mixed ability. So we set by ability. So I taught a range of abilities, but I was either teaching top set boys or the lower ability girls, and from all ages from 11 through to 18. So I developed certain ways of teaching, certain ways of managing the pupils, and certain ways of thinking, how am I delivering my subject to my pupils? And then fast forward to 2014, lots of trial and error and tears in the classroom. And I'm getting to a point where, I was thinking, okay, I've got this. It's 9 years now and I'm quite confident. I was a head of department and I think, okay, yeah, I know what I'm doing. And this is when my husband and I decided to move to Hong Kong. By this point, we had 2 children. I have 2 boys, 2 lovely boys. So we decided we wanted to move abroad, and we came to Hong Kong for the opening of North Anglia School. So that then came with its own challenges and lots of differences. I went from a very established school to one that we were building up, and I'm building up an amazing school. North Anglia is now from age 3 through to 18. So I've seen lots of growth there. And I've also had to change a lot about how I approach the pupils. In the UK, having English pupils for whom English was a second language, it wasn't so much a common thing. Maybe once a year, every couple of years, there would be a pupil who would need some help with the English in the school, the particular school that I was at. So again, it was a big learning curve, a brilliant learning curve. It's been a fun one and a really, really good experience being here in Hong Kong. As Sylvia mentioned, so I teach maths and I'm also on the pastoral team. So I specifically look at transitions and help the pupils move in to the school, new pupils, alas, the pupils moving out, and then the stages of moving in between. So what other numbers did I have on there? 3. I've got 3 on there because that's just my favourite number, and I feel as a maths teacher, I should have a favourite number. And then finally, 15 is on this slide, because I think that it was kind of 15 years before I've had what I now feel is almost an epiphany about how I should be teaching. And it was after 15 years of trial and error and feeling like I was doing the right thing to now actually seeing really marked progress in all of my pupils. And we're teaching mixed ability. I'm teaching mixed ability classes at North Anglia. So I will have pupils for whom English is their second language. I have pupils who are anxious about maths, pupils who are high flyers and who are what we would call expert thinkers and are novice thinkers, and everywhere in between. And actually, these strategies that I'm trying to put in place benefit all of those pupils. So as opposed to before, where I was thinking, well, I'm going in to teach girls today, so I need to do this. Or I'm teaching my high flyers today, the ones that I'm really stretching, I'm going to do this. This is something that applies to everybody. Okay, so I asked you on the Jamboard to tell me what's your definition of learning? So there's lots of definitions, and I was looking at your definitions and they're great. I've been trying to do lots of reading, and for me, the definition that really resonates with me, and the one that I'm kind of carrying forward and using today, is that learning is a change in the long-term memory. So this definition, what it doesn't actually say is also that the change needs to be positive and also long-lasting. So also to add to this, I'm going to add this picture of a forest. And this is from Peps McRae's idea that I also really like, that this idea of memory and that learning is a change in our long-term memory. Well, our memory is like a forest. We often think, when we think of learning, we think books, we think library, but opposed to being like books in a library, our memories are like a forest. So they're constantly growing and changing and adapting with the environment. So the idea of learning and thinking is huge. And I think to actually be able to unpack everything and dive into a deep kind of look into what is this whole process is kind of more than what I understand, I think, and more than we have time for today. So I'm going to apologise, because I'm going to condense this whole idea of learning and thinking into it's very incredibly complex notion that I'm going to put into quite a simple 4-step diagram. And this is based on Daniel Williams' idea of how we learn. So what is it that sparks that light bulb moment in the classroom? Well, Willingham says that we learn by the process of an interaction between 4 things. And actually, this is from his book, his 2009 book, Why Don't Students Like School? And he says there's this whole idea of thinking and learning is to do with the interactions between the facts that are in our long-term memory, the procedures that are in our long-term memory, the space we have in our working memory, and the information that we take in from the environment. So taking a closer look at long-term memory first. So this idea of the facts and the procedures in our long-term memory. So Willingham says that there's this interaction between these facts and these procedures that we've got stored in our long-term memory. Our long-term memory is our storage area. So the interaction can be described as knowledge. So this knowledge is everything that we know. So in other words, everything that we have ever learned. And it's kind of like a very intricate map. So the facts and procedures, we have got hundreds and thousands, millions of them, which are all connected and intricately woven, and there's links between them that form this knowledge. And the way that we organise and store these facts and procedures is referred to by scientists as schemas. And then, so these schemas can be seen as all these individual units of knowledge that are connected together. So the more knowledge that the brain has, the less strain there is then on the working memory, because we're using this knowledge to make sense of everything else that's coming in. So there is a really important caveat as far as knowledge is concerned, and it's this. So obviously this idea of schemas and knowledge and all these facts and procedures that we have going on, it's very intricate and it's huge. And there's lots of models that explain all of this. Now, one Anderson has come up with is the adaptive character of thought, ACT theory, which tells us how complex cognition works. And there's lots in this model, but the part for me that is the key takeaway about how this knowledge works is that once something has been learned, so once it is knowledge, once it is there, it's really difficult to unlearn. And this applies to whether that knowledge is correct or not. It's there, it's always there. So we have this idea that practice makes perfect, but actually we should be thinking that practice is permanent. So there's a lot of thought that once something's learned, it's always there. We never forget it, but our ability to retrieve it, to access that knowledge, to bring it back to the forefront of our knowledge is what makes something either there or not. But if this idea is that practice makes permanence, then what we're getting our pupils to practice has to be correct. Because otherwise, what we're doing is ingraining misconceptions. So the knowledge that we've got stored, which helps us to think about and understand and then ultimately remember new information, has to be correct in the first place. So what's going into our long-term memory has to be correct information. So that's what our long-term memory is. So let's now have a think about the space in our working memory, because this is where we process and we start to make the connections between our knowledge and the new information that's coming in. So the working memory is, oh dear, that's not letting me move on, I'm sorry. So the working memory, or the space in the working memory, is the working memory is the place where thought occurs. And obviously when thinking occurs, that's our learning. And whereas we believe that the long-term memory is infinite, we can just keep storing and storing and storing our facts and our procedures and our schemas, and we can retrieve them. The thing with the space in our working memory is that it is finite. So if there's limited space, it means it can overflow. There's lots of different theories about how much space we have and how many pieces of information we can hold before that space overflows. I think even though there's some discussion about it, everybody agrees that it is a low number. And I think the general agreement is it's somewhere around about 4. So maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less, but everybody agrees it is a small amount of space. And the other thing that everybody agrees about working memory is that if the working memory is overloaded, then learning cannot take place. So this is where us as teachers come in. We can control the information that we are providing from the environment. Now, Daniel William, I go back to him. He says that memory is the residue of thought. So our knowledge, our memories, our long-term memories are based on what we're thinking about. So as teachers, we always need to make sure that our pupils are thinking about the correct things. So we need our pupils to be thinking or attending to the correct things. And this is what we can control. So we've gone through the idea, in very simplistic terms, I know, of the facts and the procedures in long-term memory, which together form our knowledge. And that this knowledge is then interacting with space in the working memory and the information that we are putting in, which is the information from the environment. Okay, so I'm going to pause talking for the moment because we're going to look at a short video. Now I'm going to say this is actually a very famous and very well circulated video. So I am thinking that some of you may have seen it before. We're going to watch it together anyway, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. Hopefully, here we go, I can play this video.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
Okay. So, as I said, some of you may well have seen that video before. I'm actually going to ask you, hopefully the Jamboard comes back up if you don't still have it open. I just wanted to ask you to go back to the Jamboard, and there is a question on page 4, which is, have you seen the video before? And then there's 2 more pages with questions. If I can just get you to answer those questions, please. So the questions on those slides were, have you seen the video before? And as I said, I've definitely got some yeses. Some people have seen it before. They know what they're looking for. Oh, I know what I didn't ask was how many passes, but the answer will come up in a moment. And then the other 2 questions were, did you see the gorilla? And I'm really pleased somebody said no, actually, because when I first saw it, I didn't see the gorilla either. And I was saying, what? What gorilla? And did you notice anything else? Okay, so I'm so pleased that somebody didn't notice the gorilla, because as I said, when I first saw that video and somebody said, did you see the gorilla? And I said, there wasn't a gorilla. There definitely wasn't a gorilla. I am going to play it again in a moment. So if you were the person who did not see the gorilla, you will. Oh, there's a few people who didn't see the gorilla. Okay, I will play it again. And a couple of people said, was it on a loop? And also asked, was it 12 passes? We'll see if that is correct. Okay, I'm just going to play the rest of this video. Oh, somebody's saying 15 passes. It actually wasn't. I did get the number of passes correct. A good maths teacher can count, but I didn't see the gorilla. Okay, let's have another look at that video. There we go. The correct answer was 16 passes. But then if I just play the rest of this.
The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
Okay, so now, whether you've seen that clip before or not, as I said, it's kind of been circulated a little bit. And as I said, I did not see the gorilla. A tiny bit of background about this video. So it was created by 2 cognitive scientists, Daniel Simons and Christopher Chatteris. I have to read his name. And it was to highlight their research into something called inattentional blindness. And it was actually made in the early 2000s. They were doing their research out of Harvard University. And as I said, the first time people saw the video, about 50% missed the gorilla. And it's because you're concentrating on something else. So this idea of inattentional blindness is sometimes referred to as the elusive obvious, because when you see it again, you almost think to yourself, how did I not see that gorilla? And it's this idea of things being hidden in plain sight. Now, the interesting thing is it is a very well circulated video, which means if you're looking for that gorilla in the first half, you know it's coming up. You see the gorilla. But then what's interesting is that people also miss, because they're looking for the gorilla, they miss the other things that happened, like the curtain changing colour and one of the players in black just stepping away from the screen. So what it kind of highlights is that even when we're concentrating and we think we're really focusing hard on something like counting, it's really important to miss things. And what we want to be doing in the classroom is to kind of cut down on pupils missing information, because it might be tiny things they miss, or it might be something that's huge. But the more we can try to stop them missing things, obviously, the more learning is going to take place. So let's go back to
the correct answer.
Oh, play the video again. Sorry. So going back to controlling what our pupils are thinking about. We need to consider how we're receiving this information into our all-important working memory that we know is a finite space. We're going to run out of room. So it's believed that we receive the information into our working memory in two ways. So there's this multi-component model of working memory. It says we have two channels. We've got the phonological loop, which is the speech and the things we hear, the auditory information, and then a visuospatial sketchpad. So this is our visual information, the things we see and the spatial relationships. Now, we have these two channels. We can only process limited amounts of information in either of these channels at any one time. So on slides that we deliver lessons on, or slides like this, the text that we see is stored first of all in our visuospatial sketchpad because we're seeing it. And then this information is passed into the phonological loop, because what we're then doing automatically is you actually say the words you see in your head. So any form of talking that you hear whilst you're reading the slides on a text is also going to need to be stored in that channel, the phonological loop. And then if we've only got limited space to store information, this is where the problems start to arise. So we could argue that reading out words that are on a slide has absolutely no effect at all. It's redundant because it's doing nothing for learning if somebody can just read that information for themselves. All we're doing is adding an extra layer of information which has to be processed and dealt with. So what does this mean then as teachers? Because that's kind of a summary of all of my research on where I've got to. So what am I doing now? So in the beginning, I asked you to say this is the Badley and Hitch model, just so you know where this has come from. So right at the very beginning on the Jamboard, I asked you to say, well, what does learning look like in your classroom? And this is where I kind of feel, I said it was 15 years, where I kind of feel I've done the wrong thing. Not done the wrong thing, but it's been a process. So I think for the majority of my career, I've believed that if my pupils are able to take part and to discuss and contribute and take part in demonstrations, that this is helping them to be actively engaged in their learning. So, for example, if I'm delivering a key point in my lessons and I want to describe a process, then I have in my mind, I need to ask a question to every child in the room, because then they're all contributing. And then they're all giving me their thoughts, they're giving me an idea, so they're all active, they're all engaged. And if somebody was coming in and observing my lesson, I want them to feel the buzz in the room, and I want to feel them to see the pupils talking and collaborating and just for themselves coming up with solutions. And there's this whole idea about the inquiry, ways of pupils discovering the learning for themselves. I've spent hours and hours and hours coming up with exciting and creative ways to introduce topics. I don't know, trying to think, how can I use Smarties to introduce the idea of Pythagoras' theorem, and how can I get these pupils to be coming up with these things? Oh, I'm just sorry, I can see something was happening on my screen. And how can I come up with ways of really creatively and in exciting ways getting pupils to gather this information? But the thing is that what I've not been taking into account for all this time is that for me to have creative and independent and flexible pupils, they have to have a foundation. They have to have the knowledge, that is the facts and the procedures, those schemas stored in their long-term memory to make sense of what we're actually doing in the lesson. And if I'm not making sure that that knowledge is correct, well, then I'm prohibiting them from going further in their learning. So that's why I've now decided that I'm an advocate, and something this is very difficult for me, of silence in the classroom. I think there is a place for activities and the creativity, but when it comes to the really crucial first stage of delivering a new topic, silence is the key to them being able to move forward. So the idea of silence in a classroom, and I think this is a thing which is often an obstacle, is that we often have negative connotations to the idea of silence. We don't always view it as a good thing. I know that I'm definitely guilty of, in the past, particularly in the early stages of my teaching career, of using silence as almost a threat and saying with a chatty class, okay, you're now working in silence because you clearly can't control the level of talk. And that is something that I have definitely been guilty of. And this idea of having pupils sat in silence whilst a teacher just talks at the front of a room is almost viewed, I would say, there has always been these two thoughts of what's progressive and what's traditional. And maybe that's viewed, pupils sitting in silence. It looks as though those pupils are not actively engaged. I think as well that pupils sometimes have this bad or a negative view of silence. They're not used to it. I think in this digital age that we are in now, we're surrounded by noise in absolutely every single sense of the word. We've got a deluge of information and noise non-stop from our pupils have phones, they have their laptops. We've just gone through a prolonged period of online learning. They have information at their fingertips. There is so much going on that actually to be able to appreciate and take time to reflect is a skill that I think some of our pupils are in danger of not having properly. And to be able to be active in your silence is something that is going to serve them well in the long run. I think as well with the idea of silence with pupils is they often relate it to tests. And tests, for a lot of our pupils, they view it as something that's quite scary or intimidating and something to be dreaded. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Me as well, as a teacher, I think I'm somebody who's quite scared of silence. And as a person, I talk a lot. I'm somebody who tends to talk and talk. So this has been quite a big switch for me as well. But bearing in mind that we know that cognitive overload is the enemy of learning, this is what I am trying to do now. Give you a moment to read and not talk. So these are the things or the strategies or the things that I'm almost like my mantra that I'm trying to remember when it comes to my planning and how I am in the classroom. So first of all, I do the teaching. Sounds obvious, but as I said earlier, my preferred delivery would always be to kind of engage everybody in a classroom discussion. And obviously I teach maths. So say I'm going through how to solve an equation. I would get everybody involved and I'd be saying to everybody, okay, so what do we do next? What do you think? And by offering that out to the class, I thought that I was kind of triggering that thought process. But there's a big issue with this because basically one of three things could happen. If you're throwing a question out there and getting pupils to contribute their thoughts at this initial, and I'm talking about this initial stage of learning, delivering a new topic. Okay, you could get the correct answer straight away. Great, move on to the next stage. But just because one pupil has understood that straight away, it doesn't mean that everybody else in the class has. Maybe I get the incorrect answer. And in the past, I might then have started to discuss those incorrect answers or write them up on the board and say, okay, so what do you think? So Johnny's told me this. Theo, what do you think? Is that the right answer? Is it the wrong answer? Where are we going here? What do we think what is our next step? And actually what that does is it breeds confusion. So for those pupils who maybe have got it, that might make them frustrated, thinking, well, hold on, I think I knew this, but now she's saying, is that the right answer? I don't know. And then for our pupils where maybe they need more time to think, or then they're getting confused and thinking, well, actually, what is the right answer? Is it that one, or is it that one? Or is it what my friend said? And then sometimes we get a partially right answer. And that's almost the most dangerous, because what we want in this crucial stage is that we want the clarity. We want our pupils to know exactly what is it that I am learning. So I've stepped well away from the pupils discovering the key point of a lesson for themselves. And I tell them, and it almost feels like you're spoiling the surprise at Christmas, but what they can then go on to do with that then becomes something else, because that knowledge is there. So we want our pupils to see and to hear clear, articulate and correct information. So I've removed the redundant. And this is the thing that for me, as I said, is quite tricky. So when I'm delivering this knowledge, my pupils now know that they sit in silence. So nobody makes notes at this point. Everybody watches. And I will model an example, or I'll put the information on the board and I'll allow them time to process it. I will be silent. I let them read for themselves and I let them think. And I let them think, well, why has she done that? They know I'm doing the right things. They know I'm modelling the correct steps. So it gives them the chance to think, why? Why has she done that? Why is that correct? How does she then move on to this? So I give people time. We then discuss questions afterwards. In maths, it's quite very black and white. I can put my preferred way is to put my modelled example on one side of the board, and then I'll put a very similar question on the other. And this is when the pupils can try for themselves. And for some of them, they can understand why. And then for some of the pupils, they then start to have questions. Well, why did you do that? And this is when I know that I have at least shown them a correct, definitive answer and process that they can then start to pick apart the parts they don't understand. And then obviously that can then go into practice, and I know they're practicing the correct method, and then I can extend them in different ways from there. The other redundancy, so the thing is that silence, I was going to say, isn't passive. They're not just sitting there, not doing anything. They're watching and they're making connections for themselves, and they're wondering about the things that they want to think about and to make those different connections. So I've controlled what's going in to that working memory and ultimately the long term. I think Peps McRae and this idea of being a silent teacher, he likened it to being a cinema. And I really like this analogy, because as people go into a cinema, they might be chatting and talking to their friends, eating popcorn, which doesn't happen in my lessons, I'm just going to say this. But as soon as the lights go down, everybody focuses on the film. And that's what you're trying to do. You're getting everybody to be absolutely focused on the part, the highlight that you want to deliver. Removing the redundant talk, as I said, hard for me because I speak lots. And I noticed this when we were working virtually, is that I feel silences. So the pupils will be working and I might say something like, oh, I'm a little bit cold. I think I'm going to turn off the aircon. Oh, are you cold as well? Oh, you've put your jacket on. Are you too hot? Are you too cold? What do you want me to do? all that's doing is putting information that pupils have to process into their phonological loops, and it's unnecessary. So I have to work really hard to not say, oh, that was funny, look at that. Or, oh, I'm not sure why that's not working. To really just, when those pupils are silent and working, to just step back and just not do anything. If I need to say something important to the pupils when they're working, I will often hide what's on the screen or say to them, just close your books for the moment. And then I know that I'm only putting information in. I'm narrowing down all these different channels. I stay still. You might have noticed if you're watching me, I use my hands a lot. I do talk with my hands. But then that's adding an extra thing that pupils are watching. I try not to move around. When pupils are working in silence, I might say to them, okay, in 5 minutes, I'm going to walk around the room. But other than that, I don't just walk around the room, because otherwise a pupil might start thinking, oh, where is she going? Oh, I hope she's not going to come and look at what I'm doing. Where's she going now? And it's just that one distraction when you want them to be perfectly focused on the part that is important. So this silence, this noise, it's not just the talk, it's the movement. It's the everything that is happening in that room. Now, I've also rethought some of my strategies. I'll talk about one in particular very quickly in a moment. I test lots, which is often seen as a bad thing. And I've also lowered the stakes. So with those three things, I just want to talk a tiny bit more, but I'm going to change this slide because we've been looking at it for a while. So a very common strategy, one that I've always said, yep, I use think, pair, share. Always, all the time. Now, this is one of the strategies that actually I suddenly stopped and thought, yeah, I do think, pair, share all the time. But do I actually do it properly? Because I often say to the pupils in the past, I've said, okay, have a think about this question. And then 30 seconds later, I'm saying, okay, now talk to the person next to you about what you think, and then we're going to share. Now, the important thing here is think, because we're thinking about how we learn. I would admit that I have been very guilty of not giving pupils enough time to think. And again, this is where we think in silence and to actively think. And I think before that some pupils, when I say think, pair, share, they sit there and they think, okay, it's fine. I'll stay silent for a moment and then I'm going to hear what my friend thinks. So in order to get our pupils to kind of be able to reflect, again, we need this silence. And there's a very important kind of theory from the Bjorks, Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, who say, because often one of the stumbling blocks with a think, pair, share when you're throwing something out there is pupils think, but I don't know the right answer. I actually don't know what I'm starting to think about. But what Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, who do a lot of research into memory, have said is that actually, even if you don't know an answer, an incorrect answer is also a way of learning. So pupils can even write down what they think is an incorrect answer. They might be thinking, well, I don't really know what it is that's going on here, but I can write down what I think it's not. So then that still is starting the process of making links and let them start to think, what is it that I'm doing? And this is where we want our pupils to work in silence, so it's not collaborative, because the skill that we want them to be thinking or to be doing is to be making those links for themselves. So I say to them, I want everybody to write something down, and that's what we're then going to pair and share. I'm just looking at time, I'm sorry. So this idea of testing, I said I test lots. Again, I think in the past people have said, whoa, testing is bad. Testing doesn't make somebody get better. But this idea of actually we want them to be motivated. And Tests can be sometimes unmotivating, but I mentioned Robert and Elizabeth Bjork before, and they found some really important findings in their research that actually testing should be viewed not as a bad thing and not as a way of me assessing where the pupils are, but as a learning tool. And for pupils to really know, well, what is it that I do know and I don't know? And for them to practice retrieving the correct information from their long-term memory. So they're done in silence because it's not collaborative. It's for the pupils themselves to practice retrieving the information that they need from their long-term memories. And what the Bjorks came up with is that pre-testing and testing, but pre-testing in particular, so when you start a new topic, giving pupils a test of everything that you are going to teach them actually helps them to then better understand the material when they teach it. Because they start to think, okay, what do I know? What do I not know? They start to think about links, even though they don't realise that they're doing that. And they're much better prepared to then take in that information when you provide it. And this also links back to this idea of wrong answers are not failures. Incorrect answers are actually good because it teaches us, well, I know that this is not the right answer. So then it makes us start to think, okay, what can I do to get to the correct answer? And one of the last things that I've been doing with this idea that incorrect answers are not a failure is I've said about lowering the stakes. Now, I started working on the idea of silence when I'm just inputting that first part of information into the pupils. So introducing a new topic. What I've found is that actually the pupils like it because despite what they think, they all like this idea of working in silence. And they know now that when we're practicing, when we're getting used to using a concept, they do prefer to do it in silence. And they also know that I am going to give them the chance to be more creative and play with it when I know that they have got this proper, real understanding of what the foundational knowledge is. So the idea of lowering the stakes is I'm trying to take away, especially for my more anxious pupils, that giving an incorrect answer is a failure. So when they are practicing and we're working through questions, I will have the answers somewhere in the room. And they can then go and have access to those answers at any point. So they know that they can check if what they're doing is correct or not correct. And they tend to then be doing this in silence. And this kind of has evolved that they're happy to work. It's their choice to work in silence. And by being able to have access to those answers, that silence has become less scary. They can come to me and say, they'll check their answer and then they'll say, oh, and they're reflecting and they're trying to find for themselves why that answer is not necessarily correct, which is way better than any feedback that I can ever give to a pupil if they've actually gone back and said, oh, okay, I can now see, I think this is the bit that I've done wrong. And then they can come to me and check. That's much better than me saying to them, oh, I've ticked that, I've crossed this one. Can you go back and look? 9 times out of 10, they haven't in the past, but it's actually making them self-reflect. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I've kind of whizzed through a little bit quickly. I will take any questions, but I do want to leave with just 2 things. Now, this is one thing I haven't done, and this is something that cropped up a couple of days ago, so I have added it in. I'm going to show you my classroom. Now, this is actually my board. This is my classroom. One of the things that I'm now thinking, and I said this is a work in progress, is the other day with me implementing all of my strategies with my silence, and I really feel like it's been working. I was working with a class the other day and I'd gone through and it was all good. And I said to the pupils, okay, before we begin the practice, Is there anything that anybody really wants to ask? And one hand went up, and a pupil said to me, yes, Miss, when are we going to learn about origami? And I was mortified because it made me then think that actually the displays in my room, that pupil, rather than thinking about what was happening, she was sat at the front and she was studying my origami display. And what she was then thinking is, oh, when are we going to do that? And that's not what I wanted her to take away from my lesson. So my next thing I'm thinking of doing, which is probably going to really upset my senior leadership team, is I've decided I'm going to strip everything off the front of my classroom. So again, I'm reducing that cognitive load. I haven't got lots of words which somebody might just be diverted to start thinking, oh, what is that word that's written to the right of the board? Or when am I going to do origami? So again, just to really focus them in on what they're doing. So what I have tried to impart and tried to kind of say is that, you know, there's so much theory out there. There's so much going on for our pupils. And what we all want for our pupils is for them to be active in their learning and to become these expert thinkers, to really take on board what's happening and start to move forward. And I think if we see learning as a road, and we know that that road might bend, it might curve, it might go up and down, definitely up and down hills in Hong Kong. What we want for our pupils, though, is for that road to be clear. So no matter how much it bends, goes up and down, there is limited or absolutely no chance for them to be distracted away or for them to go off onto another path where they're not learning what we need them to be learning. So the big takeaway is that I now think to myself, what is it that I am saying to these pupils, showing to these pupils, and having them take in to their working memory, which then interacts with their long-term memory to develop their learning and their thinking. Okay, that is it from me. I am sorry that, oh no, my watch is fast. It is actually 5:33. So I was going to say, did anybody have any questions or any thoughts or anything that they wanted to ask? Because I felt like I really quickly speeded up, which was maybe a good thing.
I have a question. Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. I'm interested in because your preferred method of teaching is sort of deliver the information first while the students are silent. And I'm just wondering what you personally feel about the IB and like what's your personal opinion?
So there are caveats here that I should have said that actually, is that I am doing this. So thank you for that question. I'm very much doing this with my Key Stage 3 and 4 pupils. A lot more so with my Key Stage 3, because what I'm trying to do is actually to help them to be more reflective and to think more. Now, it sounds as though all I do is have my pupils in silence. I don't. It is for that initial input stage. And what I'm trying to do with them is by the time, so in our school, we have our Key Stage 3, and then we have IGCSE for Key Stage 4, and we do the IB diploma in Key Stage 5. So for us, or for me in particular, I'm trying to help them to start to make those links and connections. So by the time they get to the IB stage, where it is really important, so for the diploma, to be able to come up with these ideas and to make those links on their own, that they're much more used to it. I think I just feel this has kind of come about a lot as well with how we've gone back to recently this period of the online learning. and a lot of pupils have developed habits and become much more easily distracted. So it's a case of trying to put that in. I do think there is a place for it in the IB, but I would say that it has to be carefully balanced, because obviously the whole idea of the IB is that we are making flexible, creative learners and thinkers for IB. But it's a very good point that this is something that I've introduced very much for my Key Stage 3 pupils, to try to build up that store that's in their minds, so as they go through school, that what's in there is correct. Does that kind of help? And
yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you for your answer. I've really enjoyed this, and you've definitely given me some food for thought, so thank you very much.
Good, I'm pleased. Okay, was there any other questions? I've not been looking at the chat. I'm hold on, if I stop sharing my screen. Oh gosh, there were some there's questions and things, or there's comments. Can we have some Smarties too? I tried to bring ice cream into a lesson once, but yes, okay. If there's anybody who had any actual anything they wanted me to answer privately or personally, put the answers, or sorry, put questions into the chat, and I'm happy to expand more on my experiences afterwards. But okay.